3 survivors, 3 blizzards, 1 horrifying mistake. Imagine this. You're trapped in a remote cabin, the blizzard is burying you alive, and then you realize the door was never locked tonight on True Terror Files Official. We have 3 terrifying accounts from people who faced nature's fury and something far worse lurking in the storm. First journey to the Appalachian Mountains, where Sophia is snowed in at Blackwood Ridge Lodge. The heavy snow deadens every sound, except for the persistent scratching at the door, a noise that shouldn't exist. The temperature drops to 40 below. Every sound outside is smothered, leaving only that scratching. Next, we travel to the Dartmoor moors. Callum thought his ancient stone cottage was safe, until he saw the heavy door swinging open. The howling wind outside covered the sound of whatever slipped inside. The wind shrieks across the moors, and visibility is 0. Callum's heart stops when he hears the floorboard creak behind him. Finally head to Australia's Blue Mountains. Amelia is stranded in a fragile ranger hut on a cliff. Ice has sealed the windows shut. Then she notices fresh tracks in the snow, leading straight through the unlocked door. She realizes with absolute horror she's been sharing the hut for hours. Her blood runs cold as she scans the tiny hut. These stories prove the blizzard is not the real enemy. The real nightmare begins when you realize you are not alone and the door was never locked. I never should have taken that job, but I needed the money, and the isolation of Blackwood Ridge Lodge seemed peaceful, a remote caretaker's cabin perched deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The nearest town was 20 miles away, winding down a single-lane gravel road that vanished the moment the first snowflake fell. I arrived in late November, just as the weather turned bitter. The lodge itself was ancient hand-hewn logs blackened with age, creaking floorboards that whispered secrets with every step. I was completely alone, and I preferred it that way, or so I thought. The first 2 days were quiet. I stocked the firewood, checked the generator, secured the windows against the coming storm. The forecast warned of a blizzard, a once-in-a-decade system that would bury the entire ridge under 6 feet of snow. I felt prepared. I had supplies for a month, but nothing could have prepared me for what came with that storm. The snow began falling around noon on the 3rd day, soft and silent, blanketing the world in an eerie white hush. By evening, the wind picked up, howling through the pines like something wounded and desperate. The temperature plummeted, 30 below, then 40 below, the kind of cold that kills you in minutes if you step outside unprotected. I sat by the massive stone fireplace, feeding split logs into the hungry flames, watching the shadows dance across the rough-hewn walls. The power flickered once, twice, then died completely, leaving me with nothing but firelight and the absolute suffocating silence of the blizzard outside. That's when I first noticed something strange. The snow absorbs everything, sound, light, even the wind seemed muffled, as though the world had been wrapped in a thick wool blanket. The silence was so complete, so heavy, that I could hear my own heartbeat thumping inside my ears, and beneath that rhythm, something else, a faint scratching sound coming from the front door. I froze, holding my breath, straining to listen. The scratching was rhythmic, deliberate, not the random scrape of a branch in the wind. It stopped for a moment, then resumes. 3 long scratches, pause, 3 more, as if something was testing the wood patiently, methodically. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a bear seeking shelter from the killing cold. The Appalachian Mountains are full of wildlife, black bears, coyotes, nothing that would truly threaten a grown woman inside a locked cabin. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace, the metal cold and reassuring in my grip, and crept toward the door. The scratching stopped the instant my foot touched the first creaking floorboard. I waited, counting my breaths. 1, 2, 10. Nothing. I pressed my eye to the small frosted window beside the doorframe, peering out into the swirling white chaos. There was nothing there, just the endless curtain of falling snow and the shapeless mounds of drifts piling against the porch. I checked the deadbolt. It was securely locked. I had locked it myself hours ago. I double-checked the chain, also secure. I exhaled shakily, laughing at my own foolishness. A caretaker alone in the wilderness, letting her imagination run wild from a little ice scraping against the wood. I returned to the fire, leaned the poker against the hearth, and tried to calm my racing heart. The silence returned, deeper now, more oppressive. The wind outside had stopped completely, and that was somehow worse, because without the howling, I could hear everything, or rather, I could hear nothing at all, and that absence of sound became a presence of its own, pressing against my eardrums, filling my head with a low, dull roar like the inside of a seashell. I must have dozed off, because I woke with a violent start. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting the room in deep orange shadows. I didn't know what had woken me at first. Then I heard it again, scratching, but louder now, more insistent, and it wasn't coming from the front door anymore. It was coming from the window, the one directly behind my chair. My blood turned to ice water. I sat perfectly still, every muscle locked rigid with primal terror. The scratching traced a slow arc across the glass, like a fingernail dragging through frost, a high-pitched squeal that drilled straight into the back of my skull. I could see nothing through the window. The glass was completely frosted over opaque, with a thick rime of ice, but I could hear breathing. Slow, heavy, wet breathing on the other side of the glass, mere inches from where I sat. The thing outside exhaled, and a patch of frost melted slightly from the warmth of its breath, revealing a dark, glistening shape pressed against the pane. I didn't wait to see what it was. I lunged from the chair, grabbed the poker, and scrambled to the far corner of the room. The breathing continued, steady and unhurried. The scratching stopped, replaced by a soft thump, then another as if something heavy was shifting its weight on the porch outside, pacing slowly along the length of the lodge. I tracked the sounds with my eyes wide and unblinking. The thumping moved past the front door around the side wall, toward the back of the cabin where the kitchen door led out to the woodpile. The woodpile door, the thought hit me like a physical blow. I had been out there earlier in the day, gathering an armload of split pine before the storm truly hit. I remembered my arms full of wood, struggling with the latch, kicking the door shut behind me with my boot, but I could not remember. I could not remember if I had locked it. Panic surged through my chest like electricity. I ran through the dark lodge, navigating by memory and faint emberlight, down the narrow hallway past the bedroom, into the small kitchen at the rear of the building. The door was there, solid oak with iron hinges, and it was slightly ajar. A thin ribbon of snow had blown through the crack, piling into a small drift on the kitchen floor. The cold air pouring through that gap was so intense it burned my lungs. I slammed the door shut with my shoulder, fumbling with the deadbolt, my fingers numb and clumsy. The bolt slid home with a satisfying clunk, and I staggered backward, gasping, staring at the closed door with wild eyes. Something had already been inside. I could feel it. The air in the kitchen was different. Colder, carrying a faint musky odor like wet fur and rotting leaves. I turned slowly, raising the poker in my trembling hand, scanning the dark corners of the small room. The firelight from the main room barely reached here, leaving pools of absolute blackness around the cupboards and the old cast-iron stove. A sound behind me. A soft exhale, not from outside, from inside the lodge. I spun around, the poker slicing through empty air. Nothing, just the dark hallway stretching back toward the main room. But at the far end of that hallway, something moved. A shadow within shadows, low to the ground, fluid. Wrong. The shape was too long, too angular. It moved with a strange jointed gait, like an insect mimicking a mammal, limbs bending in directions that made my stomach lurch. It paused at the threshold of the firelit main room. And for one frozen heartbeat I saw it clearly in silhouette. It was tall, emaciated, its spine a jagged ridge of visible vertebrae pressing against taut grey skin. The head was wrong, elongated, with no discernible ears or snout, just a smooth sloping dome that tapered into a jaw hanging slightly open, revealing teeth that were too numerous, too needle-thin. The eyes caught the dying firelight, reflecting back a pale milky green, like moonlight on stagnant water. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat had closed completely. The creature tilted its head, a slow mechanical movement as if it was curious about me. Appraising me, then it turned and crawled directly up the stone chimney, disappearing into the flue with a scraping sound that vibrated through the entire lodge. I stood rooted to the spot for what felt like hours, listening to the sound of it moving through the walls, scratching inside the hollow spaces between the logs. The scratching was everywhere now, above the ceiling, below the floorboards, surrounding me in a cocoon of horrible sound. I backed into the main room, keeping my back to the fireplace, the poker held out before me like a talisman. The fire had died completely. Only a faint red glow remained among the ashes. I knelt down slowly, never taking my eyes off the ceiling, and threw on more kindling, the dry pine needles catching instantly, flames leaping up and driving back the shadows. The scratching in the walls intensified, agitated, as if the light itself caused the creature pain. Dawn arrived eventually, not that I could see it through the snow-choked windows, but the quality of the darkness gradually shifted from pitch black to a dim gray twilight. The scratching had stopped an hour before sunrise, fading into the walls like a bad dream receding with waking. I stayed frozen by the fire until full daylight filtered through the frost on the windows. Then I moved. I searched the entire lodge, every room, every closet, every dark corner. The creature was gone, but it had left evidence, undeniable, horrifying evidence. In the kitchen near the unlocked door were tracks in the drifted snow. Not footprints exactly, more like drag marks, deep furrows where something long and heavy had pulled itself across the floor. The tracks led from the door to the main room and then simply vanished at the base of the chimney. There were claw marks on the wooden mantel, deep gouges in the old oak, spaced far too wide for any animal I knew, and there was hair, coarse gray strands caught in the splinters, long and wiry. They had no scent I could identify, and when I held one to the light it seemed almost translucent, fading in and out of visibility like a heat shimmer. The blizzard finally broke 2 days later. A rescue snowcat came up from the town to check on me. I told them I had fallen and hit my head, that the isolation had gotten to me. Anything to avoid explaining what I had truly seen. They would have called me crazy. Maybe I was crazy, but the claw marks were real. The hair was real, and every night since, when the temperature drops and the snow begins to fall, I check every lock 3 times. The Appalachian mountains are ancient, older than the Rockies, older than the Himalayas. Old things live in those deep hollows, things that the cold does not kill, things that hunger in the dark, and sometimes when the blizzards strip the world down to silence and ice, those old things remember that cabins are not fortresses, they are traps, and a door left unlocked is an invitation. I know now that we are not the apex predators we believe ourselves to be. When the deep freeze comes and the world goes silent under a crushing weight of snow, the food chain shifts, and something else, something ancient and patient, climbs to the top. I will never forget the sound of that scratching or the sight of those milky green eyes watching me from the dark, and I will never ever forget to lock the door. I came to Dartmoor seeking solitude, a week away from the noise of London. A chance to clear my head and finish the manuscript that had been gathering dust on my desk for months. The stone cottage was perfect, ancient and weathered, perched alone on the empty moors like a forgotten sentinel. The locals in the village warned me about the weather. Dartmoor is unpredictable, they said. Storms roll in from the Atlantic with no warning. The fog can swallow you whole in seconds. I nodded politely, bought my supplies, and drove the rental car up the single winding track until the cottage emerged from the mist like a grey ghost. The building was centuries old, thick granite walls stained dark by decades of rain. A slate roof sagging slightly in the middle. Small, deep-set windows that stared out at the endless heather like hollow eye sockets. Inside, it was cramped but cozy. One main room with a fireplace large enough to stand in, a narrow kitchen with a wood-burning stove, and a tiny bedroom tucked under the sloping roof. I settled in quickly, unpacking my groceries, stacking firewood beside the hearth. The cottage had no central heating, no modern comforts at all really, just a single electric light that flickered whenever the wind picked up. The heavy wooden front door was the only way in or out, thick oak planks bound with iron straps. A door that had kept out the elements for hundreds of years. The first 2 days were peaceful. I wrote during the grey daylight hours, walked the moors in the afternoon, watched the sun set behind the distant tors in a blaze of pale gold. At night I read by the fire, listened to the wind sighing across the empty landscape. The silence was immense, broken only by the occasional cry of a distant bird or the rustle of some small creature in the heather. On the third day the sky changed. The morning dawned bruised and heavy clouds hanging so low I felt I could reach up and touch them. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath fogging inside the cottage despite the fire roaring in the hearth. By noon the first snowflakes began to fall, fat and wet, swirling in dizzy spirals on the strengthening wind. Then the wind became something else entirely. It built from a mournful sigh to a shrieking howl, a sound that seemed alive, a voice made of fury and ice. The stone walls shuddered with each blast, the old timbers groaning like a ship in heavy seas. I stood at the window and watched the world disappear, the moors erased by a wall of driving white, visibility dropping to absolute zero in the space of 10 minutes. The electricity died with a pitiful buzzing sound, leaving me alone in the gathering darkness with nothing but firelight to hold back the shadows. I lit every candle I could find, arranged them on the mantel and the rough wooden table, their small flames dancing wildly in the draughts that seeped through every crack and crevice. The cottage was not as solid as it appeared. The wind found every weakness in the ancient stonework. The howling was ceaseless, a constant pressure against my eardrums. It was like being trapped inside a scream. The wind did not just blow around the cottage, it seemed to blow through it, whistling down the chimney with such force that the flames in the hearth flattened and guttered. I piled more wood on the fire, desperate to keep it alive, to keep the light alive. That was when I first noticed the door. The heavy oak door was moving, just slightly, rocking back and forth in its frame with each gust of wind. I stared at it for a long moment, a cold knot forming in my stomach. I was certain I had locked it when I came in from my walk the previous evening. Certain I had slid the ancient iron bolt into place, but there it was, unlatched, held closed only by its own weight. I crossed the room quickly, the flagstone floor icy beneath my feet. I pressed my palm against the rough wood, feeling the vibration of the storm outside. The door was heavy, incredibly heavy, and the wind was pushing against it with tremendous force. I leaned my shoulder into it and fumbled for the bolt. The iron was freezing, so cold it burned my fingers, but I managed to slide it home with a satisfying clunk. I exhaled, my heart racing, and turned back to the room. Everything was as it had been, the fire crackling, the candles flickering, the wind screaming its endless rage outside. I told myself I had simply forgotten to lock it earlier, exhaustion and the storm playing tricks on my memory. Nothing more. I settled back into the worn armchair beside the hearth, pulled a heavy wool blanket over my legs, and tried to lose myself in the pages of my manuscript. The words blurred before my eyes. I couldn't concentrate. I kept glancing toward the door, now securely bolted, then toward the small windows, their glass rattling in their frames like chattering teeth. The wind began to sound different. Its tone shifted from a steady shriek to something more erratic. It would build to a deafening crescendo, then drop away to near silence for a heartbeat, before surging back with redoubled fury. It was in one of those sudden silences that I heard it, a sound that did not belong to the storm, a sound from inside the cottage, a soft scraping, directly behind my chair. I spun around so fast I nearly toppled from the seat, my eyes straining against the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. The scraping came again, a slow dragging noise like something heavy being pulled across the flagstones. It was coming from the kitchen, the dark narrow room beyond the main living space. Where the back wall butted against the open moor, I grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the hearth. The same motion I had made 1,000 times in nightmares. I never wanted to live. I rose slowly from the chair, the blanket falling to the floor, and took one hesitant step toward the kitchen doorway. The darkness in there was absolute. The candles in the main room did nothing to penetrate it. The scraping stopped, replaced by silence, the charged, waiting silence of something aware of my attention. I stood frozen at the threshold, the poker raised, my breath shallow and rapid. The wind screamed outside, rattling the windows, and I used that noise to mask my voice as I whispered into the dark. "Who is there? Who is in my house?" No answer, just the wind, and then a new sound, a wet clicking noise, like bones popping in a socket. The sound came from the far corner of the kitchen, near the back door that led directly onto the moor. I remembered that door, small and low, used by the original inhabitants to access the outbuildings. I had never even checked if it was locked. I lunged for the kitchen, my bare feet slapping against the cold stone. The darkness swallowed me whole as I crossed the threshold. I could see nothing, feel nothing but the biting cold that seemed to emanate from the back wall. My outstretched hand found the rough surface of the back door, and the bolt there was not just unlocked, it was broken, snapped clean off, the ancient iron sheared through like a dry twig. The door itself was slightly open, a thin gap of swirling white visible against the black. Snow had blown through the crack and piled against the kitchen table. I pushed the door shut with my shoulder, but without the bolt it wouldn't stay. It bounced back open immediately. Driven inward by the relentless pressure of the wind, I grabbed the heavy kitchen table and dragged it across the floor, barricading the door as best I could. And then I heard the floorboard creak behind me. Back in the main room, back where the firelight was. The sound was unmistakable, the distinct groan of old wood under weight. Something had moved into the main room while I was struggling with the kitchen door, something that had been waiting in the darkness of the cottage, and the howling wind had masked its entry completely. I turned slowly, the poker trembling in my grip, and looked back through the kitchen doorway toward the main room. The fire was still burning, casting long dancing shadows against the walls, and one of those shadows was wrong. It did not match any piece of furniture, any candle, any shape that belonged in the cottage. It was tall, impossibly tall, stretched and thin, standing perfectly still beside the fireplace. I could see the silhouette of long, spindly arms, fingers that tapered into points, and a head that was too narrow, too elongated, tilting slowly from side to side as if tasting the air. I pressed myself against the kitchen wall, trying to make myself invisible, trying to slow my pounding heart. The shadow did not move toward me. It simply stood there, swaying gently, and then it began to make a sound, a low, throaty murmur that cut through the screaming wind like a knife through silk. It was speaking not words I could understand, but something ancient. A language of clicks and soft hisses, a sound that vibrated in my chest and made my teeth ache. The shadow shifted, and I saw the faint glint of eyes, two pale points of light reflecting the fire, watching me from across the room. I did the only thing I could think to do. I ran not toward the creature, but toward the front door. I grabbed the iron bolt with both hands, wrenching it free, the cold metal tearing the skin of my palms. I hauled the heavy door open against the screaming wind and stumbled out into the blizzard. The cold hit me like a physical blow, the wind whipping the snow into my eyes. I could see nothing, white on white in every direction. I staggered forward, sinking into drifts up to my thighs, the cottage disappearing behind me in seconds. I had no coat, no shoes, just the thin clothes I had been wearing inside. I was dead in minutes if I stayed out here. But I could not go back inside, not with that thing waiting in the firelight. I pushed forward, the wind screaming in my ears, my body already going numb from the cold. I stumbled over something hidden in the snow, a low stone wall perhaps, and fell face first into a drift. The cold was so intense it felt like burning, my limbs refusing to obey my commands. I lay there, sinking into the snow, and I heard the front door of the cottage slam shut behind me. The wind had caught it, or something else had. I rolled onto my back, the snowflakes melting on my face, and I saw a shape emerge from the white chaos above me, tall and thin, leaning over my prone body. The pale eyes looked down at me, and I felt a strange calm wash over my frozen limbs. The creature studied me for a long moment, its head tilting at that impossible angle, and then it simply turned and walked away into the storm, vanishing as though it had never been there at all. I don't know how long I lay in the snow, minutes, hours, but eventually the survival instinct kicked in. Some primal stubbornness that refused to let me die out there alone. I crawled back toward where I thought the cottage must be, my hands and knees numb and bleeding, until I collided with the stone wall and pulled myself along it to the front door. The cottage was empty. The fire had burned down to embers, the candles had guttered out, but there was no sign of the creature, no tracks in the snow inside, no evidence at all except one thing. The back door was still barricaded with the kitchen table, but the heavy wooden front door, the one I had bolted so carefully, the one I had wrenched open in my terrified flight, was now closed, and the bolt was slid into place from the inside. Something had locked me out, and then something had let me back in. I sat huddled by the dying fire until dawn, wrapped in every blanket I could find, listening to the wind slowly die away. The storm passed with the sunrise, leaving the moors buried under a silent blanket of white. The village rescue team found me 2 days later, suffering from hypothermia and severe frostbite. I lost 2 toes to the cold, but I never told them the truth. The cottage still stands on that lonely stretch of Dartmoor. I drove past it once, years later, just to see if it was still there. It was, the grey stone unchanged, the small windows dark, and in the deep snow beneath the back door, I saw tracks. Fresh tracks, long and strange, leading from the moor straight into the cottage. I never stopped there again. I never will. The howling wind on Dartmoor is not just empty noise. It is a warning, a voice that tells you to check your locks, to bolt your doors, because in the screaming chaos of a blizzard, when the world is reduced to white noise and ice, you will not hear what slips inside until you feel its breath on the back of your neck, and by then it is already too late. I still check my doors every night, 3 times, sometimes 4. I listen to the wind outside my window, and I remember the pale eyes watching me from the firelights, the sound of that ancient voice murmuring in the dark, and I know with absolute certainty that the door was unlocked for a reason, and something on the moor had been waiting for me to realize. The Jenolan Wilderness Outpost was never meant to be a permanent posting. It was a temporary ranger station, a flimsy wooden hut bolted to the edge of a sheer cliff deep in the Blue Mountains. I volunteered for the winter survey because I wanted the solitude, a month alone cataloging the frost patterns and ice formations unique to that elevation. The hut was barely more than a shed, one small room with a bunk bed, a tiny potbelly stove that struggled to keep the interior above freezing, and a single door that opened directly onto a narrow ledge overlooking a 200-foot drop. The Blue Mountains are beautiful in summer, lush eucalyptus forests and cascading waterfalls. But in winter, they become something else entirely. A frozen wasteland of howling winds and treacherous ice. I arrived in mid-June, the start of the Australian winter. The road in was already choked with snow. The last 10 kilometers took me 4 hours in a 4-wheel drive with chains on the tires. By the time I parked at the trailhead and loaded my pack for the final hike to the outpost, the sun was already sinking behind the jagged peaks. The hike was brutal, a narrow goat track winding along the cliff face, sheer rock on one side, empty space on the other. The wind whipped up from the valley below with a sound like tearing canvas. I kept my shoulder pressed against the rock wall, feeling the ice crunch beneath my boots with every careful step. By the time the outpost came into view, a dark smudge against the white cliff, my fingers were completely numb. I pushed open the heavy wooden door. It stuck in the frame. Swollen from the moisture, I had to throw my full weight against it. The hinges screamed in protest, and I stumbled inside, slamming the door shut against the wind. The silence that followed was almost as overwhelming as the storm had been. A muffled, dead quiet that pressed against my eardrums. The hut was exactly as I had been told. Small, Spartan functional, a single bunk with a thin mattress, a wooden table bolted to the wall, the potbelly stove in the corner with a small stack of firewood beside it. There was one window, a tiny square of double-glazed glass set into the wall facing the cliff. The view was breathtaking and terrifying, nothing but empty air and distant snow-covered valleys stretching to the horizon. I checked my supplies, enough food for 3 weeks, a satellite phone for emergencies, a first aid kit, and a single kerosene lantern that would be my only light source once the sun set. There was no electricity up here, no running water, nothing but me and the mountain and the gathering storm. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire in the stove, the small space warming quickly. The wind moaned outside, but the hut held firm. I lay on the bunk and listened to the mountain breathe. A low, constant sigh that seemed almost organic, as if the cliff itself was alive and sleeping restlessly beneath its blanket of ice. The snow began in earnest on the second day, not the gentle flakes of the city, but a furious onslaught of ice crystals that drove horizontally past the window. The temperature dropped to 20 below, then 30, then colder than any reading my thermometer could measure. The wind found every crack in the wooden walls. Thin streams of frigid air that cut through the warmth like razor blades. I fed the stove constantly, watching my firewood supply dwindle with growing unease. The satellite phone sat on the table, my lifeline to the outside world. I checked it every hour, reassuring myself that the signal light still blinked green. Outside the tiny window, the world had vanished, consumed by a swirling white void that seemed to press against the glass like something hungry. It was on the third night that I made the discovery that turned a difficult survival situation into a waking nightmare. I had been dozing in the bunk, the stove crackling softly, the lantern turned down to a faint glow, when I was jolted awake by a sound that cut through the storm's constant roar, a scraping, metallic and deliberate. Coming from the door, I sat up instantly, my heart hammering, listening. The scraping came again, a slow dragging across the wood, not the random battering of wind, but something intentional, something testing the barrier between the frozen chaos outside and the fragile warmth of the hut. I swung my legs off the bunk, the cold floor searing the soles of my feet, and stared at the door, the latch. I had been so exhausted when I arrived, so focused on getting the fire lit and my frozen clothes dried, I could not remember locking it. I could not remember sliding the small iron bolt into place. The door had been difficult to close, swollen in its frame, but I had not thought to check the lock, not for 3 entire days. I crossed the small space in 2 strides, my hand reaching for the bolt. The scraping outside stopped the moment my fingers touched the cold iron, as if whatever was on the other side knew I was there, could sense my presence through the wood. I held my breath, my pulse thundering in my ears, and slid the bolt home with a sharp click. Silence, thick and suffocating. Even the wind seemed to pause. And then came the breathing, a slow, wet rasp from directly outside the door, inches from where I stood frozen. The sound was heavy, labored, the breathing of something large compressing its lungs against the freezing air. I backed away from the door, step by trembling step, until my shoulders hit the far wall. The breathing continued for a long time, minutes, maybe an hour. I lost all sense of time standing there in the flickering lantern light. Eventually it faded, receding into the storm, or perhaps I just stopped hearing it over the pounding of my own heart. I did not sleep again that night. I sat on the bunk with my back pressed to the wall, watching the door, waiting dawn, brought a brief respite, the storm easing just enough for pale gray light to filter through the ice-crusted window. I risked opening the door, just a crack, to peer outside. The ledge was buried under fresh snow. a pristine white carpet that stretched from the door to the cliff edge, and in that snow were tracks. They were not animal tracks. I knew the prints of every creature that lived in these mountains: wallabies, wombats, the occasional feral dog. These were different, long and narrow, deeply pressed into the snow, as if whatever made them was heavy. The tracks emerged from the swirling white along the cliff path, approached the door, and stopped. No tracks led away, nothing retreated back along the ledge. The tracks came directly to the door and ended, and the door that had been unlocked all night, showed a thin gap where the swollen wood had not sealed fully against the frame, a gap just wide enough for something to slip through if it wanted to. I slammed the door shut, my breath catching in my throat. I checked the interior of the hut with wild, desperate eyes. The single room offered no hiding places. The bunk was too low to crawl under. The table was open beneath. The stove glowed in the corner. There was nowhere for anything to hide, nothing in the hut with me. I was alone, but the tracks told a different story, and I began to notice details I had overlooked in my initial panic. The snow that had blown in through the gap during the night had formed a small drift on the floor just inside the door, and that drift was disturbed not by my footprints. I had not stepped there, but by something else. A long sweeping mark, as if something had dragged itself across the floor. The mark led from the door across the wooden planks toward the bunk and stopped at the small wooden ladder that led up to the storage loft. The loft I had never bothered to check because the ranger who briefed me said it was empty, just a crawl space for storing equipment during the summer months. Too small for a person, but not too small for something else. I looked up. The ceiling of the hut was low. The loft, nothing more than a few planks laid across the rafters directly above the bunk, a dark, narrow space barely 2 feet high. I had not looked up there, not once since I arrived. I had simply assumed it was empty, but the drag marks in the snow led directly to the ladder. And the silence from above was not the silence of an empty space. It was the silence of something listening, something waiting, something that had been above me while I slept. The psychological terror of that moment is impossible to describe. The realization that you have been sharing a tiny sealed space with something unknown, something that crept in while the storm howled and the door swung loose, something that had been inches above your head in the darkness, watching, breathing, waiting for what I did not want to know. I grabbed the lantern and held it high, the yellow light pushing back the shadows in the loft. I saw the rough wooden planks, the dust and cobwebs, and then I saw movement, a slow shifting of something pressed against the far corner of the crawl space, something that did not want to be seen. It was pale, unnaturally pale, the color of frost-bitten flesh. It was curled into a tight mass, limbs folded in ways that made no anatomical sense. I could see the curve of a spine, the sharp angles of ribs, and then the head slowly turned, and I saw its face. There were no eyes, just smooth, hollow sockets that seemed to absorb the lantern light. The mouth was a ragged slit that hung slightly open, revealing a dark, wet interior that glistened in the flickering glow. It made no sound, just stared at me with that eyeless face, and I understood with absolute primal certainty that I was not looking at a person. I was looking at something that had been on this mountain long before the hut was built. Something that the cold had preserved rather than killed. I ran. There was nowhere to run, but I ran anyway. I lunged for the door, fumbled with the bolt. My fingers useless with terror, I wrenched the door open and threw myself out onto the ledge, the wind instantly tearing the breath from my lungs, the cold so intense it felt like being struck by a physical force. The cliff path was sheeted in ice, completely impassable. I took one step and my boot slid toward the edge, toward the 200-foot drop into the white abyss. I caught myself on the rock wall, my fingers scrabbling for purchase on the frozen stone. I was trapped between the impossible cold and the impossible horror inside the hut. I turned back toward the open door, and I saw it emerging, the pale thing unfolding from the darkness of the doorway, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that was almost beautiful. It did not seem to feel the cold. The wind did not touch it. The snow did not settle on its grey-white skin. It stepped out onto the ledge, and I saw its full form for the first time, tall and gaunt, arms too long, ending in hands with fingers that tapered into wicked dark points. It did not attack, it simply stood there between me and the only shelter, and I understood then that it was not hunting me. It had already found me. It had been in the hut with me for 3 days, breathing my warmth, feeding on my presence in some way I could never comprehend, and now it was simply waiting for the mountain to do its work. I don't know how long I stood on that ledge, the cold seeping into my bones, my consciousness beginning to fragment. The creature watched me with those hollow sockets, patient, eternal, and then it turned and walked to the edge of the cliff, stood on the precipice for a heartbeat, and stepped off into the void. It did not fall. It simply descended, drifting down into the white chaos like a leaf on still water, vanishing into the storm. I crawled back into the hut, barely able to move. I slammed the door and bolted it, and collapsed on the bunk, shivering so violently I could not draw a full breath. The rescue team found me 4 days later. The storm had passed, and I had managed to send a single garbled message on the satellite phone before the battery died. They said I was suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration, that I was delirious, hallucinating. I let them believe that. But before I left, I made them check the loft. They climbed the ladder and searched the crawl space and found nothing, just dust and a few old tools. But I saw the look on the lead rescuer's face when he climbed back down, the way he avoided my eyes, the way he hurried everyone out of the hut faster than necessary. He had seen something. Maybe not the creature, but something, a mark, a residue, something that told him the loft had not been empty. He never said a word about it, none of them did, and I never returned to the Jenolan wilderness. I know now that the old mountains hold old things, things that do not fear the cold because they are the cold, things that slip through unlocked doors when the blizzards rage and the world goes blind. The tracks in the snow told the truth. Something came inside while I slept. Something stayed with me in that tiny hut, and on the coldest nights when the wind howls and the ice forms on the inside of my windows, I still feel those hollow sockets watching me from the dark corners of my own home. I lock my doors now. I check them obsessively. But sometimes I wake in the dead of night to the sound of scraping at the wood, and I know that no lock in the world can keep out something that was never human. Something that belongs to the frozen places, something that remembers the taste of my warmth and is patient enough to wait for the next storm. The fire is dying, the cold is creeping closer, and you're still thinking about that scratching at the door. The real terror was never the blizzard, it was what slipped inside while the world went white and silent. You felt it in the pit of your stomach, that primal fear that reminds us we are not alone in the dark. If these stories left you breathless, you belong here. At True Terror Files Official, we live for the true encounters that freeze your blood long after the screen goes black. Every week, we dig deeper into the shadows, into the snow, into the places where reality frays and nightmares bleed through. Now it's your turn to join the hunt. Smash that like button if you survived all 3 stories. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a single terrifying upload, and drop a comment below. Tell us which story had you checking your locks. We read every single one. Your fear fuels the next investigation. Stay terrified, stay vigilant, and never ever leave the door unlocked.